The evening air hung heavy with expensive perfume and the soft clink of crystal glasses. Victor Blackwood stood in the center of his grand living room, basking in the admiration of his guests. At 45, Victor had everything money could buy. A sprawling mansion overlooking the city, cars that cost more than most people's homes, and the kind of confidence that only comes with knowing you never have to check your bank account before making a purchase. Tonight was one of his famous parties, where the elite of the city gathered to see and be seen. Business people, local celebrities, and social climbers all dressed in their finest, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, hoping to impress the man who had built a tech empire from scratch. "The view from up here makes everyone else look like ants," said a woman in a shimmering gold dress, gesturing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the twinkling city lights below. "That's the point," Victor replied with a smirk, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I didn't work my way up from nothing to stand at eye level with everyone else." The guests around him nodded appreciatively. Victor loved these moments, being the center of attention, the man everyone wanted to please. He had come a long way from his humble beginnings, and he never let anyone forget it. His success story was his favorite topic of conversation. While the party swirled around him, Elena Vasquez quietly moved through the crowd, nearly invisible despite being right in the middle of everything. At 26, she had worked as a maid in wealthy homes for almost 4 years now, but Victor's mansion was by far the most extravagant. She had only been working here for 2 weeks, and was still getting used to the endless rooms and Victor's demanding standards. Elena wore the simple black uniform with white trim that Victor required for all household staff. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she kept her eyes down as she collected empty glasses and wiped away spills before they could stain the imported marble floors. She had learned early on that the best household staff were the ones nobody noticed, until something went wrong. "You there?" Victor's voice cut through the party chatter. "The tray on the side table needs refreshing. More champagne immediately." "Yes, sir," Elena said quietly, turning to fulfill his request. As the night went on, the party grew louder. Someone had brought out cocaine in the downstairs bathroom, though Victor pretended not to notice. He might be wealthy now, but he remembered enough about struggling to know that a blind eye was sometimes the most valuable currency. "Tell us about your new acquisition." "Victor," said a silver-haired man who owned half the real estate in the downtown area, "I heard you bought out that struggling software company for pennies on the dollar." Victor's face lit up. Nothing pleased him more than discussing his business victories. "They thought they had leverage," he said, leaning back against his custom leather sofa. "Their technology was innovative, I'll give them that. But their leadership was weak. I just waited until their funding dried up, then swooped in and took what I wanted." "Ruthless," the man said with approval. "That's why you're where you are." Elena moved around the periphery of the room, gathering discarded napkins and straightening cushions when guests shifted to different conversation circles. As she worked, she found herself near the grand piano that stood like a gleaming black island in the corner of the main living area. It was a magnificent instrument, a Steinway concert grand that must have cost more than Elena would make in 10 years. She paused for just a moment, her hand hovering over its polished surface. She couldn't help but notice that despite its prominent placement, the piano showed no signs of use. No sheet music, no worn keys, just a perfect, expensive showpiece. Victor caught her looking. Something about the wistful expression on the maid's face irritated him. He had noticed her before. She was new, quiet, efficient. But now she was standing there, staring at his piano like she had any right to admire it. "Do you like my piano?" he called out, causing several nearby guests to turn and look. Elena jumped slightly, embarrassed to be caught distracted from her work. "It's beautiful, sir," she said softly, immediately returning to dusting a nearby shelf. But Victor wasn't finished. Something about the way she had looked at the piano bothered him. It wasn't the admiration of its cost or status, something he understood well, but something else, something that felt like recognition. "It should be beautiful," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It cost $300,000. Handcrafted in Germany. The same model used in Carnegie Hall." The guests murmured appreciatively, as they always did when Victor mentioned the cost of his possessions. "The funny thing is," he continued, moving toward the piano with his drink in hand, "I can't play a single note. Never had time for lessons, but that's the beauty of money, isn't it?" You can own things simply because you want them. The guests laughed on cue. Elena kept her head down and continued working, hoping to fade back into invisibility. "What about you?" Victor said suddenly, pointing at Elena. "Do you play?" The room quieted as all eyes turned to the maid. Elena felt her cheeks grow warm under the sudden attention. "A little, sir," she answered softly. "A very long time ago." Something flickered in Victor's eyes. Amusement, cruelty, or perhaps just the need to entertain his guests. He had been drinking steadily all evening, and now his inhibitions were lowered just enough to think that what came next was a good idea. "Well then," he said with an exaggerated gesture toward the piano, "perhaps you should entertain us. Show my guests that I hire only the most accomplished help." Elena froze, her cleaning cloth clutched tightly in her hand. "Sir, I should really continue with my duties. The kitchen staff will need help with—" "The kitchen staff can wait," Victor interrupted, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "I'm curious now. You looked at my piano like you knew something about it, so show us." A few of the guests looked uncomfortable, but most seemed amused by the developing scene. For Victor, it was just another way to show his power, the ability to make someone do whatever he wanted in his home. "Come on," a woman urged with a giggle. "It'll be fun, like one of those TV shows where regular people have hidden talents." Elena looked around the room, seeing nowhere to escape. The other household staff had conveniently made themselves scarce, knowing better than to get caught in one of Victor's moments. With reluctance, she set down her cleaning supplies on a side table and slowly walked toward the piano. Victor watched her approach with a satisfied smile. He enjoyed these little moments of discomfort he could create. In his mind, he was teaching a valuable lesson: know your place. He expected she would play some simple, childish tune, or perhaps nothing at all, and everyone would have a good laugh before returning to their conversations. As Elena reached the piano, she hesitated before the bench. "Please, sir. I haven't played in years," she said quietly. "All the more entertaining for us then," Victor replied with a dismissive wave. "Sit." The party had gone completely silent now, all eyes on the uncomfortable scene unfolding. Elena slowly sat down at the piano bench, her uniform looking starkly out of place against the glossy instrument. She stared at the keys for a long moment, her hands resting in her lap. Victor leaned against the piano, looking down at her with amused expectation. The crystal glass in his hand caught the light from the chandelier overhead, sending fractured rainbows across the ceiling. "We're waiting," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Elena took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. They felt cool and familiar under her fingertips, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. She closed her eyes briefly, seeming to gather herself. The guests watched with varying expressions, some embarrassed, some entertained, a few concerned. No one spoke. Even the servers had stopped to watch the drama unfold. For Victor, this was just another Tuesday night. Another reminder to everyone in the room of who held the power. He had no idea that in a few moments everything would change. Elena's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. Her fingers hovered over the keys for one more heartbeat. Victor smiled in smug anticipation, completely unaware that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. Elena's fingers touched the keys gently at first, as if reacquainting themselves with old friends. The room held its breath. Then, without warning, the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the air. The opening was soft, almost hesitant, like raindrops before a storm. But there was something in those first few notes, a depth, a control, a hint of what was to come, that made several guests exchange glances. This was not the fumbling of an amateur. Victor's smirk faltered slightly. He took another sip of his drink, watching Elena's hands move with increasing confidence across the keys. The gentle introduction gave way to faster passages, her fingers flying with precision that couldn't be faked. The party guests, who moments ago had been waiting for an awkward performance to mock, now stood transfixed. Elena's back remained straight, her eyes half closed, as if the music was coming not from memory but from somewhere deep inside her. Her uniform suddenly seemed absurd, like finding a diamond wrapped in newspaper. As the piece progressed, becoming more complex and emotional, Victor's expression transformed from amusement to confusion to disbelief. The Chopin Ballade was not a simple piece. It required years of training, exceptional skill, and deep emotional understanding. It was the kind of piece that separated casual players from true pianists. And here was his maid, the woman who had been silently cleaning his home for 2 weeks, playing it as if she was born to do nothing else. A woman in a designer dress whispered to her husband, "That's no amateur." Victor heard her, but couldn't take his eyes off Elena's hands. They moved with such confidence and grace, bringing forth sounds from his unused piano that he had never imagined possible. The expensive instrument, which had been nothing more than a status symbol, came alive under her touch. The piece built and built, growing more complex, more passionate. Elena's body swayed slightly with the music, her face transformed. Gone was the quiet, head-down maid who blended into the background. In her place sat an artist, completely immersed in her craft. Some of the guests had closed their eyes, carried away by the beauty of the performance. Others watched with open mouths. No one touched their drinks. No one whispered. The usual networking and social climbing of Victor's parties had come to a complete standstill. As Elena approached the piece's climax, her fingers moving at incredible speed, Victor found himself gripping the edge of the piano. His knuckles had turned white. He had heard this piece before, at a concert hall where he had paid thousands for front-row seats to impress a date. But somehow in his own living room, played on his own piano by his own maid, it felt completely new. When Elena finally struck the last chord, the room fell into a silence so complete that Victor could hear the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. For several seconds, no one moved. Elena's hands remained on the keys, her head bowed slightly as if returning to earth from someplace far away. Then the spell broke, and the room erupted in applause. Genuine, enthusiastic applause, not the polite clapping that followed most party performances, but real appreciation. Several guests were on their feet. "Brava!" called out an older gentleman. "Absolutely magnificent." Elena seemed to suddenly remember where she was. Her shoulders tensed and her hands quickly retreated to her lap. The transformation was startling. One moment an artist in complete command, the next a maid again, looking uncomfortable under the attention. That was... Victor started, but for once words failed him. He had been prepared to mock, to laugh, to assert his superiority. He had not been prepared for this. A middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair pushed forward through the crowd. "Excuse me," she said, looking closely at Elena, "but aren't you Elena Vasquez?" Elena's eyes widened slightly. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I thought so," the woman exclaimed. "I was at your junior recital at Juilliard 7 years ago. You played the Rachmaninoff concerto. Everyone said you were headed for greatness. Then you just disappeared." The room buzzed with this new information. Victor felt strangely off balance, as if the floor had tilted beneath him. Juilliard, the most prestigious music school in the country? "Wait," said another guest, a man who served on the board of the city symphony. "Elena Vasquez, the prodigy. I remember reading about you. There was talk of international competitions, recording contracts." Elena's face flushed deeply. She stood up from the piano bench, smoothing her uniform with trembling hands. "If you'll excuse me," she said quietly, "I should get back to work." "No," Victor found himself saying, his voice sharper than he intended. "No, you should explain." The room went quiet again, but differently now. Tense, uncomfortable. Victor felt dozens of eyes on him, judging his tone, his demand. Something was happening here that he didn't fully understand, and he hated not understanding things, especially in his own house. "Mr. Blackwood," Elena said softly, "I'd really prefer not to discuss my personal life." "You work for me," Victor replied, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "And I'd like to know why someone who plays like that is cleaning my floors." A few guests shifted awkwardly. Some found sudden interest in their drinks. Others began quietly moving toward different parts of the room, sensing a conversation not meant for entertainment. Elena stood very still, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Victor's shoulder. Then she took a deep breath and met his gaze directly for the first time since she'd been hired. "Life doesn't always go as planned, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Sometimes choices are made for us." There was something in her eyes. Not anger or defiance, but a dignified sadness that made Victor suddenly aware of his own behavior. The alcohol in his system, which had fueled his earlier arrogance, now left him feeling slightly sick. "Elena was on scholarship at Juilliard," the silver-haired woman explained. either not noticing or not caring about the tension. One of the youngest in her program. I follow the classical music scene closely. There was a family emergency, wasn't there, dear? Elena nodded slightly. My father passed away suddenly. Heart attack. My mother had left years before. I have 3 younger siblings. She said it simply, without self-pity. But the implications were clear. A young woman with extraordinary talent, forced to abandon her dreams to care for family. Victor felt something uncomfortable squirm inside his chest. But surely there were other options, he said, his voice less commanding now. Scholarships, patrons. Music scholarships covered tuition, not living expenses for 4 children, Elena replied. And my siblings needed more than money. They needed someone there, someone stable. The party had effectively split now. Most guests had drifted to other rooms, continuing their networking and champagne sipping, leaving a small circle of people around the piano. The rest of the household staff had reappeared, quietly clearing glasses and serving fresh drinks, studiously avoiding looking at the scene by the piano. So you just gave it all up? Victor asked, genuinely perplexed. The concept was foreign to him. He had built his success by putting himself first always. Family obligations, relationships, everything came second to his ambitions. Elena's expression softened slightly. I didn't see it as giving up. It was a choice. My siblings needed me more than the world needed another pianist. But you're not just another pianist, the symphony board member interjected. What I just heard? That was extraordinary. Elena smiled, a small, genuine smile that transformed her face. Thank you, but I don't regret my choice. My youngest sister starts college next year. On scholarship, pre-med. Pride glowed in her eyes for a moment before she composed herself again. And now, Mr. Blackwood, if you'll excuse me, there are dishes that need attending to. She turned to go, but Victor found himself reaching out, stopping just short of touching her arm. Wait, he said, unsure of what exactly he wanted to say. The usual Victor, confident, commanding, slightly cruel, seemed to have temporarily abandoned him. The guests who remained watched with interest. Victor Blackwood, at a loss for words? This was new territory. Play something else, he finally said, gesturing toward the piano, but his tone had changed completely. Where before there had been mockery and the expectation of embarrassment, now there was something almost like pleading. Elena looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand what was happening. Then she glanced at the piano, a flash of longing crossing her face. Please, Victor added, the word feeling strange in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had said it and meant it. After what seemed like an eternity, Elena nodded once and returned to the piano bench. The small audience gathered closer. Even a few guests who had drifted away began to return, drawn by the promise of another performance. As Elena's fingers touched the keys once more, Victor Blackwood felt something shift inside him, something fundamental that he couldn't quite name. He only knew that somehow, in some way, things would never be quite the same again. This time, Elena chose something different. Her fingers began to dance across the keys in a playful, lighter melody, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The piece floated through the room like moonlight on water, gentle yet somehow more intimate than the technical brilliance of the Chopin she had played before. Victor found himself sinking into a nearby chair, his drink forgotten in his hand. The party around him seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the music and the remarkable woman creating it. He watched her face as she played, the slight furrow of concentration between her eyebrows, the way her lips parted slightly during the more complex passages, the complete transformation that had occurred. In her uniform, with her hair pulled back simply, Elena should have looked out of place at the magnificent piano. Instead, it was as if she belonged there and everything else. The expensive furniture, the designer clothes, even Victor himself was somehow intruding. As the final notes of the Debussy faded away, there was again that moment of suspended time before the applause began. This time it was even more enthusiastic, with several guests calling out praise and requests. Play the Rachmaninoff. Do you know any Liszt? Something from Bach, please. Elena smiled, a genuine full smile that lit up her entire face. It struck Victor that he had never seen her smile before tonight. She had always been just another staff member, practically invisible. Now she was the center of his party, and his guests, people who typically cared only about stock portfolios and real estate deals, were gathered around his piano like children at story time. "One more," Elena said, her voice stronger now, more confident. "Then I really must get back to work." Her fingers poised above the keys for a moment before launching into something completely unexpected. A jazz piece, complex and modern, full of unexpected harmonies and rhythms. Victor recognized it as a Thelonious Monk composition, though he couldn't name which one. He wasn't even aware his piano could sound like this, soulful, almost human in its expressiveness. Several guests began to sway slightly with the rhythm. The woman with silver-streaked hair looked delighted. A classical pianist who can play jazz. Now that's versatility. When Elena finished, she stood up to a chorus of brava and enthusiastic applause. For a brief moment, she seemed to bask in it as if remembering something long forgotten. Then she smoothed her uniform, gave a small, almost formal nod to the group and turned toward the kitchen. Victor found himself moving before he fully realized what he was doing. "Elena," he called, catching up to her at the edge of the living room. "A word, please." The remaining guests watched with interest. Victor Blackwood pursuing his maid for a conversation? The evening had certainly taken an unexpected turn. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood?" Elena asked, her expression carefully neutral again, though something still glimmered in her eyes. A confidence, a dignity that hadn't been visible before. Victor suddenly realized he had no idea what to say. He who prided himself on always being 3 steps ahead in any conversation found himself at a complete loss. "That was impressive," he finally managed, immediately feeling the inadequacy of the word. "Thank you, sir," Elena replied politely. An awkward silence stretched between them. Around them, the party had begun to return to normal, though there was a different energy now. Several guests were discussing classical music. Others were sharing the video clips they had taken on their phones. "How long have you been playing?" Victor asked, genuinely curious. "Since I was 4, Elena said. My father was a music teacher. Not famous or wealthy, but passionate. He taught at a public school during the day and gave private lessons in the evenings." Victor nodded, trying to imagine growing up in a household where money was tight but music was plentiful. His own childhood had been the opposite. Materially comfortable but emotionally barren. "And you went to Juilliard on scholarship?" "Yes, full ride." A hint of pride crept into Elena's voice. "I was 16 when I was accepted, 16. Victor tried to remember what he had been doing at 16. Mostly getting into trouble, cutting school, dreaming of making it big someday. "Mr. Blackwood," Elena said, glancing toward the kitchen. "I should really take the rest of the night off," Victor interrupted. The words surprised him almost as much as they seemed to surprise her. "Sir, you've more than earned it," and he hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Perhaps you'd join us?" "As a guest, not staff." Elena blinked, clearly taken aback. "Join the party? But I'm not dressed for—" "No one will care," Victor said, waving a hand dismissively. "Not after what they just heard." Elena looked down at her uniform, then back at Victor, confusion evident in her expression. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Blackwood, but I don't think—" "Victor," he said suddenly, "if you're going to be a guest at my party, you should call me Victor." Something flashed in Elena's eyes. Surprise, wariness. He couldn't quite tell. "That's not appropriate, Mr. Blackwood. I work for you." "Not tonight," Victor insisted, feeling increasingly off balance but unable to stop himself. "Tonight you're the most talented person in this room, and everyone knows it, including me." The admission cost him something. Victor Blackwood was not a man accustomed to acknowledging others' superiority in any area. But the truth was undeniable. What he had witnessed tonight went beyond skill into the realm of true artistry. Elena studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine his sincerity. Then she shook her head slightly. "Thank you for the offer, but I'd rather not." She spoke gently but firmly, and Victor found himself backing down. Another unusual experience for him. "At least get yourself something to eat," he said, gesturing toward the elaborate spread of food in the dining room that he knew his staff rarely got to enjoy. "And perhaps we could talk more another time." Elena's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps," she agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Good night." With a small nod, she turned and walked not toward the kitchen, but toward the staff quarters, her back straight, her steps unhurried. Victor watched her go, aware of a strange feeling in his chest, not quite regret, Not quite admiration, but something new and uncomfortable. "She's remarkable," said a voice beside him. It was the silver-haired woman, Diane Reynolds, he now remembered, a patron of the arts who sat on several museum boards. "What a waste, a waste?" Victor repeated, turning to her. "For someone with that level of talent to be cleaning houses." Diane shook her head. The classical music world lost something special when she dropped out. "I remember the buzz about her at Juilliard. They said she had the potential to be one of the greats." Victor frowned, something about her words striking him as wrong somehow. "She made a choice," he said, surprising himself again. "For her family." Yes, very noble," Diane said with a small wave of her hand. "But still a tragedy for music. Someone should have stepped in. A patron, a foundation." Her words trailed off meaningfully, her gaze on Victor suddenly speculative. Victor took a sip of his drink, uncomfortably aware of what Diane was suggesting. Him? Become a patron of the arts? The idea was absurd. He bought art as investment pieces and status symbols, not out of any deep appreciation. And yet, the memory of Elena's music lingered in the room, almost tangible. He found himself glancing at the piano, seeing it differently now, not as another expensive possession, but as an instrument capable of creating something transcendent in the right hands. "Something to think about." "Victor," Diane said with a knowing smile, patting his arm before drifting away to join another conversation. The party continued around him, but Victor remained somewhat apart from it, his thoughts circling back to Elena and her music. He had always believed that people ended up exactly where they deserved to be in life. The wealthy and successful had earned their position, just as the struggling had earned theirs. It was a convenient philosophy for someone who had clawed his way to the top, allowing him to enjoy his success without guilt. But now, that certainty felt shaken. Elena Vasquez clearly deserved more than cleaning his floors and serving his guests. Her talent was exceptional, her sacrifice for her family admirable. What did it say about the world, about him, that she was here in his employ rather than on a concert stage? For the first time in longer than he could remember, Victor Blackwood felt something akin to shame. And alongside it, something even more unfamiliar stirred within him. The desire to right a wrong that wasn't technically his, but that somehow suddenly felt like his responsibility all the same. As the night wore on, he found himself making excuses to pass by the piano, running his fingers lightly over keys that now seemed imbued with a new significance. Tomorrow, he decided, he would speak with Elena again. He wasn't sure what he would say or offer, but he knew one thing with unexpected certainty. Things could not simply return to how they had been before. Morning came with a clarity Victor rarely experienced after one of his parties. Usually he woke late, head pounding from too much expensive whiskey, memories of the previous night somewhat blurred around the edges. But today was different. He woke before his alarm, the events of the evening crisp and vivid in his mind. He showered and dressed with unusual care, choosing a casual but well-tailored outfit, rather than his usual power suit. Today wasn't about business meetings or intimidating competitors. Today was about a conversation he wasn't quite sure how to have. When he entered his kitchen, he found his chef preparing breakfast. The house was quiet, being cleaned and put back in order after the party by the staff who always arrived early for post-event cleanup. "Have you seen Elena this morning?" Victor asked, trying to sound casual. The chef looked surprised at the question. Bosses didn't typically inquire about specific staff members unless there was a problem. "I believe she's cleaning the guest bathrooms upstairs, sir." Victor nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He took a few sips, trying to organize his thoughts. What exactly did he want to say to her? What was he offering? He wasn't entirely sure himself. With coffee in hand, he made his way upstairs, feeling strangely nervous. He found Elena in the third guest bathroom, on her knees scrubbing the marble floor. She wore the same plain uniform as yesterday, her hair tied back practically. Nothing about her appearance suggested the transformation he had witnessed the night before. She looked up as his shadow fell across the doorway, immediately starting to rise. "Mr. Blackwood, good morning. Is there something you need?" No, please," he said, gesturing for her to stay comfortable. "I was hoping we could talk." Elena straightened anyway, removing her cleaning gloves. "Of course, sir." Victor glanced around the bathroom, then gestured toward the hallway. "Perhaps somewhere more comfortable?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Elena's face, but she nodded and followed him downstairs to his study, a room she cleaned regularly, but had never been invited into as a guest. Victor closed the door behind them and motioned for her to take a seat in one of the leather armchairs across from his desk. He chose not to sit behind the desk but took the chair next to hers, trying to create at least the illusion of equality. Elena perched on the edge of the chair, clearly uncomfortable. "Is everything all right, Mr. Blackwood? If this is about last night, I apologize for any disruption to your party." Victor blinked in surprise. "Apologize? No, not at all. You were extraordinary." A faint blush colored Elena's cheeks. "Thank you, sir. I've been thinking," Victor continued, setting his coffee down on the small table between their chairs, "about what happened last night." "About you, your talent?" Elena said nothing, waiting. Her posture remained straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You should be playing professionally," Victor said bluntly, "not cleaning my bathrooms." Something flickered in Elena's eyes. A brief flash of what might have been pain quickly controlled. "That's very kind of you to say, Mr. Blackwood, but as I explained last night, I made my choices for good reasons." "Your siblings?" Victor nodded. "You said the youngest starts college soon?" "Yes, next fall. Isabella. She's brilliant. Got a full scholarship to study medicine." Pride warmed Elena's voice when she spoke of her sister, and Victor felt an unexpected twinge of envy. No one had ever spoken of him with that kind of love. "And the others?" he asked. "Miguel is 21, working and taking night classes in computer science. Lucia is 23, already working as a nurse." Elena smiled softly. "They've all done so well despite everything." Victor nodded, thinking. "So they're grown now. Independent or nearly so?" Elena's expression became guarded. "Yes, which means you could return to music," Victor said. "If you wanted to." Elena was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. "It's not that simple, Mr. Blackwood. I've been away from serious study for 7 years. The classical music world doesn't just welcome people back with open arms after that kind of absence. But your talent isn't enough," Elena interrupted, then immediately looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, but it's true. There are thousands of talented pianists competing for every opportunity. The ones who succeed are the ones who never stop practicing 8 hours a day, who have the right connections, who can afford the right teachers and coaches." Victor leaned forward. "What if money wasn't an issue?" Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. "I don't understand." "What if—" Victor hesitated, then plunged ahead. "What if I were to sponsor you? Pay for whatever you need, teachers, coaches, living expenses, so you could focus entirely on your music." Elena stared at him, genuine shock on her face. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," Victor said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Why?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You hardly know me." It was a fair question, one Victor had asked himself throughout the restless night. Why did he care what happened to this woman? Was it just guilt? Fascination with her talent? Something else he couldn't quite name? "Because it would be wrong not to," he finally said. "Some things are simply right or wrong. Letting your talent go to waste when I have the means to prevent it would be wrong." Elena studied him carefully, as if seeing him for the first time. "That's not the answer I expected from you, Mr. Blackwood." "No?" Victor smiled slightly. "What did you expect?" "Something about investment potential. Tax write-offs. How it would look good for your public image to support the arts." Victor laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised them both. "Well, those things are true too, but they're not the reason." A small smile played at the corners of Elena's lips. "This is very generous, Mr. Blackwood, incredibly generous, but..." Elena took a deep breath. "I would need to think about it. This isn't a small thing you're offering. It would change my entire life." Victor nodded, feeling an unfamiliar sense of respect. Most people jumped at any offer involving his money, never stopping to consider implications or strings attached. "Of course, take whatever time you need." He hesitated, then added, "And there would be no obligations. Beyond pursuing your music, I mean. No conditions?" Elena's eyes widened slightly, and Victor realized with a flash of shame what she might have been concerned about, what wealthy men sometimes expected in return for their generosity toward young women. "Nothing." "Like that," he said quickly. I would be a patron, nothing more. I'd have no claim on you or your career. The tension in Elena's shoulders eased slightly. Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Blackwood. An awkward silence fell between them. Victor wasn't used to having his offers met with anything but immediate acceptance, and he found himself uncharacteristically wrong-footed. There's one more thing, he said suddenly. Elena looked at him questioningly. I'd like to hear you play again, not to evaluate you or test you, he added quickly. Just because I'd like to hear it. For the first time that morning, Elena's face relaxed into a genuine smile. I think I'd like that. They moved to the living room, to the magnificent piano that had been nothing but a showpiece until yesterday. Elena sat down at the bench, took a deep breath, and began to play. This time she chose Bach, a prelude that started simply but grew increasingly complex. Victor sat nearby, eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. There was something different about hearing her play in the quiet morning light, without the audience of party guests. It felt more intimate, more real somehow. When she finished, the final notes hanging in the air between them, Victor opened his eyes to find Elena watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked. You really do love music, she said softly. I wasn't sure last night with all the people around. But I can see it now. Victor was taken aback. I don't know much about it. That's not the same thing, Elena said. Some people with encyclopedic knowledge of music never really feel it. And some people with no technical understanding at all can be deeply moved by it. You're the second kind. The observation felt strangely personal, as if Elena had seen something in him that he hadn't fully recognized himself. Will you play something else? He asked. Elena nodded and turned back to the keys. This time she played something he didn't recognize, something modern and a little melancholy. What is that? He asked when she finished. I don't think I've heard it before. Elena looked slightly embarrassed. You haven't, it's mine, something I composed a long time ago. Victor stared at her. You write music too? I used to, Elena shrugged. Just for myself. It's beautiful, Victor said simply. Elena looked down at the keys. Thank you. In that moment, Victor Blackwood made a decision that would alter both their lives in ways neither of them could fully imagine. But he didn't announce it dramatically or make any grand promises. He simply said, I have meetings this afternoon, but would you be willing to play again tomorrow? Perhaps you could show me more of your compositions. Elena looked surprised, then pleased. I'd like that. As she stood to return to her duties, Victor added, And Elena, whatever you decide about my offer, the piano is yours to use whenever you want. You've brought it to life. It belongs to you now more than it ever did to me. The smile she gave him then was worth more than any business deal he'd ever closed, any luxury he'd ever acquired. It held genuine gratitude, respect, and perhaps the beginnings of trust. As he watched her walk away, Victor realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. For the first time in many years, possibly for the first time ever, he cared more about what another person needed than what he himself wanted. The sensation was strange, uncomfortable even, but not entirely unpleasant. 1 year later, the concert hall hummed with anticipation. Every seat was filled, the crowd a mix of classical music enthusiasts, curious newcomers drawn by the buzz, and wealthy patrons of the arts. In the front row center sat Victor Blackwood, uncharacteristically nervous, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She'll be wonderful, said Diane Reynolds, seated beside him in an elegant silver gown. Stop fidgeting. Victor gave her a tight smile. I know she will. I just feel responsible, Diane supplied with a knowing look. That's what happens when you become a patron, my dear. Their success becomes personal. Victor nodded, though he knew it was more than that. Over the past year, Elena Vasquez had become more than just a talent he sponsored. She had become important to him in ways he still didn't fully understand. The lights dimmed and the audience quieted. The stage remained empty for a moment, then Elena walked out from the wings. Victor's breath caught in his throat. Gone was the maid's uniform, replaced by a simple but elegant black gown that sparkled subtly under the stage lights. Her hair, usually pulled back severely when she had worked for him, now fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked confident, poised, and utterly at home as she approached the piano and gave a graceful bow to the enthusiastic applause. As Elena took her seat at the grand piano, her eyes found Victor's in the front row. She gave him a small private smile before turning her focus to the instrument before her. When she began to play, Victor was transported back to that night a year ago when he had first heard her. But this was different. Then she had played beautifully despite years away from serious practice. Now, after a year of intensive study with top teachers, her playing had reached another level entirely, more nuanced, more confident, more uniquely her own. The program began with Chopin, the same ballade she had played at his party, but moved through a carefully curated selection that showcased her versatility and emotional range. The audience was captivated, the hall so quiet during her playing that even the softest pianissimo passages carried clearly to the back row. For the final piece of the night, the program simply listed original composition. When Elena announced that she would be playing a piece she had written, inspired by the unexpected turns life can take, a murmur of interest ran through the crowd. The piece began softly, almost hesitantly, with a simple melody that gradually gained complexity and confidence. Victor recognized elements from the composition she had played for him that morning in his living room, but it had evolved into something richer, more fully realized. There was struggle in the music, moments of discord and tension, but also resolution and a kind of hard-won joy that brought unexpected tears to Victor's eyes. When the final note faded away, there was that familiar moment of held breath before the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet calling brava and applauding until their hands hurt. Elena stood, visibly moved, accepting the ovation with graceful nods. After several curtain calls, she returned to the piano for an encore. Before playing, she spoke into the microphone for the first time that evening. "This last piece is very special to me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's dedicated to someone who reminded me that it's never too late to reclaim a dream you thought was lost." "Thank you, Victor." Victor froze, stunned by the public acknowledgement. Around him, people turned to look, some nodding in recognition of the wealthy businessman known for his recent foray into arts patronage, but Victor barely noticed them. He was focused entirely on Elena as she began to play a piece he recognized instantly, the Debussy she had played for him that night, the piece that had shown him the depth of her musicality beyond technical brilliance. When the concert finally ended and the audience began to disperse, Victor made his way backstage. He found Elena in a small reception area surrounded by well-wishers, critics, and representatives from recording companies eager to discuss her future. She saw him over the shoulder of a music critic who was enthusiastically analyzing her interpretation of Chopin. Her face lit up and she politely excused herself to come greet him. "You were magnificent," Victor said simply, handing her the bouquet of white lilies he had brought. He had learned over the past year that they were her favorite. "Thank you," Elena said, accepting the flowers, "for these and for everything else." Around them, people were watching with interest. The relationship between Elena Vasquez, the rising star of the classical piano world, and Victor Blackwood, the tech millionaire who had discovered her cleaning his home, had become something of a modern fairy tale in certain circles. But the truth, as always, was more complicated than the story people told. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Elena said, gesturing to a small group standing nearby. "My family." Victor had heard so much about Elena's siblings over the past year but had never met them. They had been understandably wary of the wealthy man who had suddenly taken an interest in their sister, and Elena had been protective of keeping those parts of her life separate while she found her footing. In the music world again, Elena led Victor to where three young people stood watching, them with curious expressions. "Victor, these are my siblings, Isabella, Miguel, and Lucia." Victor shook hands with each of them, seeing echoes of Elena in their features and bearing. They were polite but reserved, clearly still forming their opinions of him. "Your sister is an extraordinary talent," Victor said, "but I'm sure you've always known that." "Since she was little," Lucia, the oldest sister, confirmed with a proud smile. "Our father used to say she was born with music in her fingers." "We've heard a lot about you, Mr. Blackwood," Isabella, the youngest, said, studying him with intelligent eyes. "Some of it even good." "Isabella," Elena scolded, but Victor laughed. "I deserve that," he admitted. "I wasn't always. Well, let's just say your sister has taught me as much as her teachers have taught her this past year." The siblings exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them. "The after party is starting soon," Elena said, Would you all like to join us? There are some people from the symphony board I'd love for you to meet. As the group moved toward the larger reception area, Isabella fell into step beside Victor. You know, she said quietly, when Elena first told us about your offer, we thought there had to be a catch. People like you don't just help people like us without wanting something in return. Victor nodded, understanding their suspicion. A year ago, you would have been right. Isabella looked at him curiously. What changed? Victor watched Elena walking ahead of them, talking animatedly with her brother about the performance. I heard her play, he said simply. And for the first time in my life, I encountered something money couldn't buy or control. Something that made everything else seem less important somehow. Isabella studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She said you understood music even though you don't play. I think maybe you understand more than that. The after-party was a blur of congratulations, industry conversations, and champagne toasts. Elena was the center of attention, graciously accepting praise while deflecting questions about her unusual journey back to music. Victor stayed nearby but not too close, conscious of giving her the space to shine on her own. Later, as the party was winding down, Elena found him on a quiet balcony overlooking the city. Hiding? She asked, joining him at the railing. Taking a breath, Victor corrected with a smile. You're the one who should be hiding. You must be exhausted after all that. Elena shook her head. Strangely, no. Performing actually gives me energy. It always did. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city lights. I got an offer tonight, Elena said finally. A recording contract, and a European tour next spring. That's wonderful, Victor said, genuinely pleased for her. You deserve it. It wouldn't have happened without you, Elena said, turning to face him. Victor shook his head. I just opened a door. You walked through it on your own talent. Still, Elena insisted. Thank you. Not just for the financial support, but for believing it was possible when I wasn't sure I did. Victor looked at her, really looked at her. The woman standing before him now was so different from the quiet maid who had cleaned his home a year ago. Or perhaps she wasn't different at all. Perhaps this confident, passionate artist had always been there, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. What happens now? He asked. Elena smiled. Now I keep playing. Keep composing. Keep discovering what's possible. And us? Victor asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Elena's expression softened. That depends, she said carefully, on what you want us to be. A year ago, Victor Blackwood would have simply taken what he wanted without question. Now he found himself uncertain, respectful of boundaries he wouldn't previously have acknowledged. I'd like to keep being part of your life, he said honestly, in whatever way makes sense. Patron, friend? He hesitated, then finished. Or something else if that's ever something you might want. Elena studied him for a long moment. You really have changed, she said softly. Because of you, Victor admitted. Elena shook her head. No, you changed because you were ready to. You just needed to hear the right music. She stepped closer to him, her decision apparently made. I think, she said carefully, that we should see what happens next. Together. As Elena's hand found his on the balcony railing, Victor Blackwood felt something he had never experienced in all his years of acquiring wealth and power. A sense of possibility that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with becoming, perhaps for the first time, the person he was meant to be. And as the night wrapped around them, the final notes of Elena's concert seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that sometimes life's most beautiful melodies come from the most unexpected beginnings.